Hello there, everybody, and welcome to Pilgrim's Passport. Well, we're wrapping up the pastoral epistles tomorrow, if we can make it. The snowstorm coming, and I wanted to sum everything up in the second Timothy chapter 4. And basically, what Paul says is, "I give you a command in the sight of God in Christ Jesus. Christ will judge the living and the dead because his kingdom is coming. Now preach the word. In good times or bad times, preach the word. Warn them. Cheer them up with words of hope. Correct people's mistakes. Be very patient as you do these things. Teach them carefully." Now that's the role of any teacher, elder in the church, that it's good to know what you're talking about, and to correct people's mistakes. It's a very humbling thing. You know, anytime you point the finger, there are three pointing right back at you. So yet we're called to do these things. And so hopefully we can keep our minds and consciences clear enough that understanding our own limitations, our own faults, we would not neglect correcting others of other faults. Now, there's a mercy in that, because certain things are just human nature. Certain things are just bound by temperament and personality. And yet we find that the Holy Spirit can absolutely, by indwelling us and infilling us, transform these traits, these amoral traits, and make them of use and beneficial to us. It's still a struggle. It's always going to be so. And yet here you have the Apostle Paul writing what would be certainly his last letter, because shortly after this, he was executed in the Mamertine prison, taken from the Mamertine prison, and he was beheaded. Knowing that he would not write again, the apostle foretells the Spirit, through the Spirit, the future corruption of Christian doctrine, or Christendom as so called. Don't forget now, this is the 21st century. You've got instant access to truth and error. And that's where you have to check your own bias. And but one thing we do know is that the truth has been given once and for all. He says that in Jude, the 3rd verse. How instructive that in the last writings of both Peter and Paul, that the prospect of heresies that would prevail in the church, we should be directed to the study of Scriptures, and that thus we are not led to expect additional disclosures of the divine will. And man, that's so true. The truth has been delivered once and for all. Now, it's true, we have to interpret the Scriptures properly, and hopefully with our heads screwed on right and our hearts screwed on right, we'll be given the truth. And it is interesting. It is interesting that the Lord allows us to believe things that are not necessarily true. Now, I'm not talking about the essentials of the faith, but even in some essentials, God realizes he's working with fallen beings and marred beings, and it would take time. I remember Gary Selman. He told me a long time ago. He said, when I became a believer, it took me 2 years to accept the deity of Jesus. Now, certainly, Gary was saved. It was just the need for an intellectual growth and a certain bias, and then, of course, after the second year, he said, I couldn't deny it. And so that's why you have to give people a chance. Well, it says in the last days that people will be self-lovers, money lovers, pleasure lovers, not God lovers. men of corrupt minds and devoid of judgment concerning the faith. So here's the thing. We have to look within the faith and the aberrations within the faith and the false teachings and false doctrines within the church. Paul tells us very pointedly, it's not our business to judge the world. It's not our business to go around trying to, change culture or society. But it is our job to teach the truth straightly in the church and to correct so many doctrinal errors that are out there. Now, with his last breath, Paul says he exhorts all who are entrusted with the gospel to zeal, courage, and steadfastness. And then he warns against cowardice, infidelity, and worldliness. Now, if you cut down to the 10th verse, it says, Demas has deserted me. He has gone to Thessalonica. And he left me because he loved this world. Oh, wow. That's a heavy thing. Crescens has gone to Galatia. Titus has gone to Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. And long before this time, Paul wanted nothing to do with Mark. And he and Barnabas split over this issue. I think it's in Acts 13. And because Barnabas wanted to take Mark back on the second missionary journey, and Paul wouldn't hear it. But now, after the years have gone on, Paul certainly changed his opinion of Mark. And get Mark and bring him with you. He helps me in my work for the Lord. I sent Tychicus to Ephesus, and this is the pathetic scene now. Remember, the first imprisonment around AD 62, Paul was allowed a rented house, and his friends can come and greet him and bring him food and all the rest of it. Now he lay in the Mamertine prison. It's cold, it's damp, and he really was an old man at this time, and even though they were in great shape in those days, it wouldn't take long in a prison such as the Mamertine to break your spirit and break you down physically and mentally. Paul hung on there mentally, I have to say that, but physically, that's why he asked. He said, listen, bring my cloak with you. I really need that because it's cold and it's damp. And then he mentions Alexander, the one who works with metal. He did a great deal to harm me and the word. The Lord will pay him back for what he has done. And here's the key, because we can live in this la-la land where everybody's okay. I'm okay. You're okay. Well, we're not all okay. All right. And so he instructs Timothy to be on the watch for this dude, for this guy. And then he says, sadly, just think about this. The first time I was put on trial, no one came to help me. No one came to help me. And here it just basically says in the great book, The Unfolding Drama of Redemption, Paul had no complaints nor murmurings on his own account, although he regrets the attitude of some he trusted. Now that will be the crowning point in any minister's life, certainly, but any teacher, any where you have doled out a lot of trust to people, and they haven't been worthy of that trust, but you just regret the attitude, and you pray for them. You just pray that may the Lord forgive them, and but you can feel the sting of loneliness here. Everyone deserted him. Now, of course, Luke was with him, and Timothy would soon bring Mark. Then he said, the Lord stood at my side. He gave me the strength to preach the whole message, and he will see me safely to his kingdom. And then it goes on to say, final greetings. Greet Priscilla and Aquila. Erastus stayed in Corinth. And here's an interesting verse, which every faith healer, although they won't look at these verses, Trophimus I left sick in Miletus. He tells us that Timothy had stomach trouble and other infirmities. Epaphroditus was sick nigh unto death, and the apostle himself had a thorn in the flesh which the Lord refused to remove. And that was a physical affliction. It may have been brought about by Satan or the enemy, but it was a physical affliction. As Paul had the power to heal, why did he not use these in these instances? So in considering faith or divine healing, these must be taken into account. Basically, in a nutshell, healing is a benefit of the atonement. It's not a guarantee. There are forever those who rip scriptures out of context and try to apply these, and then they'll turn on the people who are not sick, who remain sick, and basically say, well, had they enough faith, they wouldn't be. I venture to say there are no miracles being done today as was done in Jesus' time, certainly. But in the book of Acts, in those very opening years, there were a couple of instances where people were raised from the dead, and people were healed of lameness, blindness, on and on. But as time went on, we start to see a pattern develops. And again, there are people who just forever believe, well, God wouldn't give me that. Don't be too sure. And these few verses you have to at least understand and question. Again, you can take verses out of context. By his stripes we are healed. It has nothing to do with physical healing. It has to do with the soul. And anyway, it is applied in Matthew 8 concerning Peter's mother-in-law. And it's interesting that Matthew, he actually changes the Greek word. And so it applies to the fact that it's a benefit of the atonement, not necessarily a guarantee. All these people went on and died. Lazarus, after he was raised from the dead, guess what? He went on and died. Finally, it says, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. And now there's a crown waiting for me. It's given to those who are right with God. He will not only give it to me. Now, this should be a no-brainer for any Christian, right? He will also give it to all those who are longing for him to return. So that should be a no-brainer, huh? But listen, there are movements today, and I will not say they're not Christians and all that, but there are certain movements today that say that Jesus came back in AD 70. I mean, what manner of interpretation can they be applying? And it says earlier in 1 Timothy that Alexander, Hymenaeus, Philetus, they taught that the resurrection had already happened. Now that's interesting because it's in a Greek culture, and the Greeks believed that the soul was immortal, but not the body. This is why when Paul preached to the Areopagus in Acts 17, basically they laughed him off the place, because soon as he said Jesus rose from the dead bodily, they just laughed into scorn and said, well, we'll hear you more on this. So this is an interesting point, that where the culture can mandate the truth. And I think that these brothers that made the mistake about the resurrection were following the Greek understanding the immortality of the soul. Well, if you want to go on with this thing, it's an amazing book to keep reading. And just a couple more points I'd like to make. Paul's last letter is of an intensely personal character. Paul decided to communicate with Timothy because he knew he was about to meet a violent death. There he was, an old and infirm man, in a Roman dungeon, forsaken by almost all of his friends, having undergone a preliminary trial, probably towards the end of AD 67. He was waiting for the next and last trial. How, we may well wonder, would such a one write? Would we not be tempted to pour out our grief from our hearts, the complaint of our spirit? God, how could you do this to me? Or question the kindness and wisdom of God? Yet there is nothing of that in this letter. Here we see how a true Christian faces death, firm in his faith, proud of his sufferings, knowing that to die is to reign with Christ, and looking with glistening eyes towards the crown laid up for him to be given him by the Lord. This greatest of saints and servants does not in this dark hour morbidly contemplate his coming decease, but is filled with love and desire for the welfare of Timothy and the future of the church. With his last breath, as I said, I'll repeat this, with his last breath, he exhorts all who are entrusted with the gospel to zeal, courage, and steadfastness, and warns against cowardice, infidelity, and worldliness. And that's all she wrote on that. It's an amazing end of an amazing life, and he was deserted by his friends. Can you imagine? I mean, and even in that, he just said, "May the Lord not hold this against them," because the Lord did stand by him. And ultimately, in the end, basically, you may be isolated to a point where your nearest and dearest don't get it. The church doesn't get it. And it may be you just come to a time when you realize, but you know what? The Lord stood by me. And that's the cool part of this whole thing. Yeah, we shouldn't get angry at those who desert us in our hour of need or whatever. They can desert us emotionally even. But is it not from the Lord that we get a realization that, hey, I'm here and I will never leave you nor forsake you? That's a cool place to be at. And I hope you'll get to that place. I'm in it now, and it's just a wonderful time. Okay, guys, love you. We'll see you on the next Pilgrim's Passport. Ta-da!